Welcome to the special edition of the County Seat. I'm your host, Chad Booth. Today we're bringing this program from Cedar City at the Utah Rural Summit. This is an annual event that addresses issues concerning rural Utah. This year's theme is Why Rural Matters, and that is the topic of our show today. Joining us for our discussion from the Office of Tourism, Vicki Varela, and from the Farm Bureau of Utah, Randy Parker, and the Governor's Energy Advisor, Cody Stewart. Thank you all for joining us today. We are going to start right in on talking about the relevance of why rural matters and why this ended up being the theme of this year's conference, for which there is, I might point out, a rather large studio audience. We hear in the national dialogue that rural America is becoming less relevant, and the subtext of that dialogue is really quite critical of all of your industries. Jobs become an issue that you are able to tout. You add quite a bit to the bottom line in Utah through tourism and the related industries, but quite often there's a complaint about the fact that, well, these aren't real jobs because they're service jobs, and that becomes a real complaint. Could you address that issue?
Well, you're right, Chad. Tourism provides a lot of jobs throughout Utah, 122,000 jobs to be exact. And what we love about tourism jobs is that, as many of you remember, that's that first job that gets our kids starting to learn the work ethic, starting to earn their money to pay for their dates and their movies and so forth. And then the great thing about tourism jobs is that it's an area where people can grow in the industry and work their way up to higher paying jobs. It's interesting that the U.S. Travel Association has done studies on this, and 2 out of every 7 people in tourism jobs earn more than $100,000 a year. So I haven't heard anybody complaining about $100,000 a year for a long time. So it's the full spectrum. Most importantly, it's a place for many people to start their careers and then work their way up.
There was a recent article in the Deseret News earlier in the week that I read, and knowing that we were doing this summit, I was quite interested to see that the participants of the panel almost got a little preview of what we were talking about today, except you. And they quoted Cody, they quoted Vicki, and somehow or another, you keep getting left out of the mix. What does agriculture bring to the table? And maybe you can dissect that down on the hoof for us.
All right, thank you, Chad. Great introduction. When a couple of articles have shown up in the newspaper, the one this week that talks a lot about agriculture, or about the public lands in the aggregate, well, it left agriculture out of the mix. A few months back, there was a graph that one of the papers that had the top industries in the state of Utah, and food and agriculture wasn't a part of that graph. From an agriculture standpoint, food and agriculture contributes $17.5 billion to the Utah economy. That equates to 14.1% of our gross state product. The governor went through these numbers very well this morning. That's about 79,000 jobs, direct jobs, and about $2.7 billion in wages. So food and agriculture is significant. When you get down to the local level, and this is what's puzzling, when you take sheep and cattle, which depend heavily on public lands and grazing and access, they make up about 1/3 of that food and agriculture mix, which then means $6 billion with a heavy tie to the grazing on the public lands, and about 5% of the state's GDP. Now, drilling that down a little further, let's take an average cattle operation out here in rural Utah, 500 mama cows. Well, with a 90% calf crop and current prices, that's about $500,000 in direct sales. With the multiplier, the ripple effect, we're talking about $750,000 coming from a 500 mama cow operation. That's significant in any part of Utah, but in rural Utah, that's huge.
You're watching a pre-recorded session from the 2013 Rural Summit on the County Seat. We'll return after these messages.
Kanab, base camp for your southern Utah adventures. You belong in Kanab.
Carbon County is typically known for its industry and coal production, but that's not all. Utah's Castle Country has something for everyone. Carbon Country Club Golf Course, with 18 great holes of perfectly manicured fairways and pristine greens, is second to none. And with 4 sets of tees, the whole family can enjoy our golf course. Plus, if you hit it bad enough, you might even find some Indian pictographs hidden in the cliffs above the 18th hole. Visit castlecountry.com for more info.
We now return you to the county seats coverage from the 2013 Rural Summit at Southern Utah University.
Cody, the question that comes up the most, or the comment that comes up the most about energy in the state is actually a comparison of state land versus federal land. And I believe that the current thought on this is that a permit on state or SITLA lands will usually take about 45 days to process at the state level. And I've heard anywhere from 2 to 5 years on the corresponding federal lands. And the question that I have is two-part for you. Do you feel that the environment is compromised by the state having a fast track to drilling permits? That would be number one. And number two, and Director Palma from the Bureau of Land Management was here earlier, and if you're here, Director, you may have already had this conversation. But my question is, if you had a chance to have a conversation about the policies and procedures, what advice would you give them?
Great questions. To your first one, is the environment harmed in any way by the state processes? I would argue and say with certainty, absolutely not. I think that the state has a very rigorous, a very thoughtful regulatory regime in place. It's something that fits Utah. The Utah regulations look at the unique geographic, the unique geological aspects of the state of Utah, and we address them. We approach those in a way that we think allows for the responsible development of energy. And you're right. You know, I've heard it's anywhere between 30 to 45 days on state lands, and anywhere between 300 to a couple of years on federal lands. It's because they're looking for different things, and at the federal level, they're trying to regulate at a different level. Sometimes those regulations are not ones that are specific to Utah. They're ones that may make more sense in other places. To your second point, recommendations. Well, that's tough. You know, one thing I want to make clear that the BLM officials, sometimes we refer to them, you know, the bureaucrats. They're great, incredible, hardworking people, and we really can't blame them in the process. Earlier today, we heard from Congressman Bishop, who took some ownership for the blame in saying that Congress, we've written laws that are too vague, too flexible. And so I think that the BLM, the Forest Service, and other federal employees are put in a tough position where they're asked to balance a lot of competing interests. They're either given not enough flexibility or too much flexibility, depending on the circumstance. So I wouldn't direct it to them. I direct it to Congress. I directed my recommendations to Congress to identify what the true priorities are for the country. What does the country want to accomplish? If we think that we need to have a more aggressive energy development in our country, then there are steps we can take to do it, and they're really not that hard to identify. There are some things we could do, but again, I think that the recipient of those recommendations should be members of Congress, not so much the bureaucrats.
Which one of you thinks they rely most as an industry on rural Utah?
Well, I think each of us could make the case. You know, in terms of the resources, just generally speaking, about 70% of all of our energy resources are found on public lands. Again, I'd say that high 90% of all of the state's energy resources are found in rural areas. That's just where they're located. That's one thing that, we can't change that fact. Even if we wanted the resources in a different location, they are where the Creator placed them. And so we go to where the resource is, and that does occasionally create some conflict. But one point I want to make is that sometimes I think we overemphasize or focus too much on the conflicts. When in reality, there are a lot of areas where there's not. There are areas where, the national parks or other areas that we want to emphasize, there's not really competing interests there with energy. Again, on occasion, rare instance there is, but in the vast majority of cases, it's pretty clearly defined. Here's an area where energy development makes sense. Here's an area where recreation or agriculture or tourism makes sense. And let's just don't lose that bigger picture in the fights over the few areas where there is some conflict.
The livestock and animal agriculture in Utah is about 70% of the gross product, the farm gate sales, which is tied heavily to the public lands and to rural Utah and so forth. But we have world-class crop production here, fruits and vegetables. Our mountain valleys produce some of the highest quality apples that are grown anywhere in the world. They produce a high level of sugar. And if you look at the microclimate along the Great Salt Lake, the vegetables and so forth that are produced there, I think Charlie Black comes to mind, and his tomatoes and corn and so forth. There's nothing equal to it. So for agriculture, it's probably heavily dominated by rural because that's the makeup of agriculture. But our rural communities are supporting some of the best microclimates, or our urban communities are some of the greatest microclimates that are available in the western United States. Plus our consumer is that 90% of the population that is urban based.
And I would say that tourism certainly is quite balanced between rural and urban. And where I'm trying to focus my energy at the Utah Office of Tourism is where the opportunities are. And there are so many rich opportunities in rural Utah. We know from our collaboration with our rural partners how much of an appetite and imagination there is to expand tourism in the rural areas, to fill in the pieces with both energy and agriculture. I would absolutely agree with my colleagues that there's a place for all of our sectors throughout the economy. The real opportunity area for tourism in rural Utah is with outdoor recreation. And that's where I'm so pleased that the governor has just named Utah's first outdoor recreation director, Brad Peterson, and he's starting to work with our rural counties to figure out county by county infrastructure and recreation plans that can help to build tourism in your economies.
I'm going to add to that, Chad, if it's okay, because one of the fun areas for farmers and ranchers for agriculture in Utah is agritourism. We're seeing corn mazes, at different venues across the state that people are just having a blast. And people that want to go on ranches and go out on cattle drives and that kind of thing. It's bringing the rural and urban together in a way that who would imagine that 50 years ago.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. And then I would add to that, farm to table. There's such an interest now in being close to the food as it was prepared. And so rich opportunities for collaboration there.
We'll return with more coverage from the 2013 Rural Summit after these messages.
The best part about raising children here in Vernal and the Uinta Basin is just the smaller community that makes you feel like when you go somewhere, you know everybody.
It's not too big, it's not too small. We're close to the Wasatch Front if there's anything we need out there.
So we packed up our 3 kids and here we came to Uinta County. And what a great place it was. What a great move.
My job has offered me the ability to college educate all 3 of my children.
My father, he was an engineer for Chevron, retired 39 some odd years. And Jeff, my husband, it's the same way. He's always worked in the oil and gas, always had a job here.
Uinta Basin has been fantastic in supporting what we've tried to do both as a business and also in the development of mountain bike trails and the sport of mountain biking.
One of the big reasons why I live where I live is I'm able to run up to a beautiful place like this and spend some good quality time. There's always plenty to do in Uinta County.
Along Interstate 70 and Highway 89 is an area that is rich with high mountain peaks, vast forests, lakes, streams, historical sites, and a climate that is perfect for outdoor adventures no matter what the season. Join us in Richfield September 16th through the 20th for the Rocky Mountain ATV Jamboree. Bring the family for guided tours of some of the finest riding in all of the state. In the center of it all, Sevier County.
August 22nd through the 25th in Lake Town, Utah is the Bear Lake Mountain Man Rendezvous. Come see, hear, smell, and taste the fun and adventure of an authentic mountain man meetup. Traders offering crafts and authentic period trade goods, as well as craftsmen demonstrating their skill. All this and more at the actual location where mountain men gather to exchange furs for supplies and prove their abilities through competition. The Bear Lake Mountain Man Rendezvous. Find out more at bearlakerendezvous.com.
You're watching the County Seat. We now return you to our pre-recorded coverage from the 2013 Rural Summit.
There seems to be a conflict that has tourism and energy in particular at odds with each other. It seems to me that hunting and the agriculture industry seem to be more at odds, at least as the way it's portrayed in the media. And I know there have been a lot of lawsuits and a lot of challenges about multiple use recreation. And there have been a lot of challenges about energy, obviously the story of the 77 leases. Can you two and your two industries, I know you two can coexist, but can your industries actually coexist within the boundaries of the state, and are these conflicts necessary?
Well, I'll just throw out for starters that I think the key word is balance. That's what Cody and I talk about when we exchange notes. That's what the governor's charged us to do. I'll just give you one example. Desolation Canyon is a spectacular rafting area. And when I go to the put-in in Desolation Canyon, you travel through a lot of exploration, oil and gas exploration all around that area. When you get down to the put-in, there's no line of sight to any of the oil and gas exploration. So you have a little sense of being out in the wilderness. And from talking with our new outdoor recreation director, that's the line of sight that he will protect to ensure that if you're out there to have a wilderness experience, you're not watching them drill for oil right in your put-in place. But there's still activity going on in the general area, and we can achieve balance by approaching these things thoughtfully and with a lot of collaboration, and build our robust economy.
I would agree. I think that what it will require is a willingness to be thoughtful, balanced, and just use common sense. You know, there are areas where I think everyone would agree that it's not appropriate for energy development to occur. And then there are areas where there are some potential conflicts. And Desolation Canyon is one example. One thing that gives me some optimism is that the technology is changing so much in the oil industry that some of those conflicts aren't going to raise their head anymore because of directional drilling. You know, the capabilities of oil and gas developers, they can reach down a mile or even 2 miles sometimes from the wellhead, and so you're able to avoid some of those conflicts. But the other side too is that as I said earlier, you know, the media sometimes likes to hype up this conflict, which I think sometimes is a little bit artificial, in that I'm not by any means saying there are not conflicts. Of course there are, but the vast majority of energy development in the state of Utah, I think, occurs in an area where people would say, yes, that's where it should occur. You know, we have some friends here from the Uinta Basin, and I've done a number of tours of some of the oil and gas development out in that area. And I would encourage anyone to go out there if you want to. If you can't do oil and gas in certain places in the Uinta Basin, you really can't do oil and gas anywhere in the world. If it's inappropriate there, then there's nowhere where it's appropriate, because these areas are barren, there's nothing going on there, and nothing will ever go on there except for oil and gas development. So those areas, again, I think we need to be very clear and say we should not be set up roadblocks, especially for those areas where there really are clearly no roadblocks or no other potential uses for those areas.
There is some conflict out there because of the slow response of the federal government to allow drilling. We've seen more and more drilling going on private lands, and because the mineral rights are where they, with the oil and gas companies, we understand that. but we would certainly like to see more of that going on out on those lands that, you know, haven't got alfalfa growing on it. They're not pastures. And I guess I'm going to segue into your comment about agriculture and hunters having some conflict. I think that's more media driven than it is reality driven. We've got a great relationship with the folks at the State Department Division of Wildlife Resources. They're now being more proactive in where livestock conflicts and private property conflicts are than we've ever seen. We appreciate where Greg Sheehan, the new director, has taken his agency. And I'll tell you, we're lockstep with the hunters on the wolf issue. We want them to stay as far north as we can, and we think the Utah Wolf Management Plan is right on target. Keep them out of here.
We'll return with more coverage from the 2013 Rural Summit after these messages.
If you haven't been to Starvation in a while, you're in for a great surprise. New campsites, new cabins, and beach improvements await your next visit. Just 2 hours away, but a world away from the Wasatch Front in Duchesne County. Starvation State Park is located 4 miles northwest of Duchesne, just off US Highway 40. Duchesne County. Close enough for business, far enough to get away.
The State of Utah School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration, SITLA, manages 3.5 million acres of Utah lands with the express purpose of providing financial support to further the education of Utah's students, while promoting local industry, oil and gas, even residential development, all at the same time. Through the careful use of trust lands, the School Land Trust Program will distribute nearly $37 million to Utah schools this year. The State of Utah School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration, building the state's permanent school fund.
You're watching the County Seat. We now return you to the conclusion of our coverage from the 2013 Rural Summit, discussing why rural matters.
I do want to turn this over to the audience for some questions, and I think that we should focus it on what these folks and their industries can do or need to do to support you, the rural community. Please take this opportunity to let them know where you feel that their efforts are deficient or could use some improvement, because that's where we will have constructive dialogue. So we're opening it up to questions. Are there any out there on the floor?
The Office of Tourism has traditionally been marketing driven, but in rural Utah there's a tremendous need for world-class tourism infrastructure, and that seems to be a gap. Have there been any discussions about how to address that gap?
Yes, there have been discussions even today on that exact topic. You're right. Our office's core mission is marketing. That means we're not in the business of building infrastructure, and we know that rural Utah desperately needs infrastructure, and we can go county by county to all of the needs. We've explored some of what's been done in other states, and there are some decent models out there. And again, I go back to our Director of Outdoor Recreation and how much synergy there is in this new appointment from our governor, and that he's going to start to focus on that exact topic as he goes county by county with recreation plans. And we are going to work together to identify what the key infrastructure needs are and some strategies that we can help rural Utah in addressing infrastructure deficits. There's a lot of resourcefulness going on in rural Utah. One example is the Stone Canyon Inn in Tropic, Utah, a spectacular little bed and breakfast place. And they've entered into a partnership with REI where they've created this custom, beautiful outdoor experience. It's a little soft for a lot of Utahns in that they have these built-up bed platforms, so you don't get any bugs in your sleeping bag or anything. And then there's a little granite bar. It's kind of different from some of the campgrounds we're used to, but I could adjust. Stone Canyon has built this in collaboration with REI, and they're bringing in very high-end tour groups to have this outdoor experience. It's right at the gate to Bryce Canyon. So just a lot of resourceful thinking going on there. Another example is in Emery County, where you've got Joe's Canyon, which is this international bouldering destination. And the economic development director there, Mike McCandless, has worked in collaboration with local and national partners as well as business folks to figure out ways to extend that tourism, bring more international bouldering folks to Joe's Valley to eat in some price restaurants and use up some time in their hotel rooms.
How do we help our urban citizens understand why rural matters? How do we deliver that message to them?
Well, from a food and agriculture standpoint, and Cody said this well, sometimes our folks in urban settings take for granted what's going on out in the rural, or along the rural landscape, and food is one of those that really folks do take for granted. We're so blessed with the average grocery store in urban Utah stocks about 40,000 different items. And you know what, when you go to the store, your expectation is all of those choices are going to be there. So I think the message is rural Utah farmers and ranchers are helping to provide for that blessing that we all enjoy as Utahns and Americans.
As I look at representing rural Utah by default through our programs on outdoor recreation and on government affairs, and we actually make the effort to get off the Wasatch Front and get into the local communities. It's just by nature of the topic of our program. So we get that feedback from you. But there are some dynamics of journalism and media coverage in the state that is probably good for people here to understand. And that is that regardless of the fact that our television market, as an example, is statewide, it is economically driven by the Wasatch Front. It's that concentration of numbers. And you say, well, why does that matter? Why that matters is that there is no incentive for their news operations to go off the Wasatch Front to find news. And so that means that when you have bad news or good news coming from your local community, if you want their attention, you're going to have to do more than just send them a press release and say, hey, something fun's going on out here in the county, because they are not going to be economically driven to spend the resources to go out into rural Utah to make it happen. Take the initiative to tell us along the Wasatch Front and in Washington and in Denver and in federal offices why rural matters, because the question of your theme really is a story that you can tell us. Thank you for joining us for the special edition of the County Seat. Remember, local government is where your life happens. We will look for you next week. And be sure to tell your friends. Take notes. We'll see you then.